Stanford University.
Thank you very much, and thank all of you for attending. We have an ongoing, continuing partnership between the Hoover Institute and the organization that I chair called the Nuclear Threat Initiative. We also have a nuclear security project that George Shultz and Bill Perry and Henry Kissinger and I and Sid Drell and Jim Goodby and Max Kampelman and a whole lot of other people who've served in public life have been part of. And we are here talking about the very important subject of deterrence. Napoleon once supposedly said to his gathered troops before they went into battle that you can do anything with your bayonet but sit on it. The nuclear equation is almost the opposite. We basically know in an age that has changed so rapidly, the one where we no longer have a Soviet Union, we no longer have a Warsaw Pact, we have growing enrichment going on around the globe, we have Iran and Iraq, we have Afghanistan, we have North Korea, all of those things, and we have the threat of catastrophic terrorism. So we are, as we said in a Wall Street Journal article 3 years ago, reaching a tipping point. 3 years ago, in that Wall Street article, George Shultz, Bill Perry, Henry Kissinger, and I called for a global enterprise to keep dangerous nuclear weapons and material out of dangerous hands, to avoid the proliferation of those weapons and materials, and ultimately to end them as a threat to the world. We called for 10 specific steps. So we went beyond a general concept of moving toward a world without nuclear weapons to the hard steps required to be able to build the confidence to move in that direction and eventually arrive at that goal. In the last 2 days, we've taken a deep dive on a number of those steps, including the whole concept of deterrence as we know it now, whether and how we would have deterrence as we move down the scale in numbers of nuclear weapons, eventually going to a world without nuclear weapons, the whole question of verification, and most importantly, the question of enforcement and how we develop the will to enforce and the institutions to enforce, even in today's world, let alone a world where we move down the scale of nuclear weapons. We talked about the past, we've talked about the present, we've talked about the future. I've compared the vision that the four of us laid out in the Wall Street Journal article of moving toward a world without nuclear weapons as beginning to climb a very high mountain with the peak fogged in. Our challenge is to find a pathway or many pathways up the mountain to talk others into joining us going up that mountain, because this cannot be a unilateral mission, and to identify a base camp or perhaps even a series of base camps that we can clearly achieve as we eventually scale the peak. It's easy to see only the potential of avalanches that may come down the mountain, including but not limited to North Korea and Iran, and to lose track of base camp and the common paths leading upward. George Shultz, Sid Drell, Jim Goodby, and others here at Stanford and the Hoover Institute have assembled a team of experts that have been very helpful in the last day and a half, and we will continue through the afternoon, in identifying both the obstacles and the avalanches as well as the paths heading upward that we must find ways to pursue. I've personally been engaged in trying to reduce nuclear danger since the early 1970s on my first trip to NATO as a United States Senator, when I became very well aware, acutely aware, of the tactical nuclear weapon and conventional posture of the United States and NATO, and the corresponding posture of the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union. And at a very young age as a senator, it dawned on me that we had a very high probability of using those tactical nuclear weapons and escalating right up the ladder if we did have a conflict in Europe. It's very easy in a conference like this to spend so much time looking and analyzing the challenges that we almost, at some periods during the day, inevitably come to a point of almost paralysis by analysis. It's easy to get into gloom and doom mode, because we all do see the huge challenges. As we were in one of those brief periods today, fortunately not much of the day is like that, I basically decided to jot down a few things that I would share with this audience just briefly at noon that have really been accomplished, that give me room for encouragement and give me the energy to continue on what I think to be a very important quest of protecting God's universe as well as American security. Let me just share a few of those with you. Many nations, number one, many nations have given up nuclear weapons or nuclear weapon programs in recent years. The most recent nations being Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, South Africa, Libya, and Syria even though inadvertently in the case of Syria. The second point is that we have dramatically reduced the number of nuclear weapons in the world, with the Soviet arsenal having been changed dramatically. 3 of those countries that inherited nuclear weapons have given them up entirely. Russia has gone down the scale in numbers of nuclear weapons, as have the United States, rather dramatically, about 2/3 of what we had at one time. Number 3, nuclear materials, a very important topic of our conference and actually the focus of the organization that I chair in terms of protecting nuclear materials wherever they are around the globe. On a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being poor grade, 10 being perfect grade, in the last 10, 15, 20 years, we have moved in the right direction to at least a 6 or 7 in terms of securing nuclear material in the former Soviet Union. And when I use the word we here, I'm not talking about just the United States. I'm talking about partnerships. Number 4, we have helped Russia deactivate thousands of nuclear warheads, launchers, and we have done that not only in the nuclear arena but also in the chemical arena. We have a long way to go on the biological side. But if you look at the light bulbs in this room or any other measure of electricity in our country, 10% of our electricity in this country comes from highly enriched uranium blended down into low enriched uranium made into nuclear fuel, and that highly enriched uranium was in warheads aimed at the United States 20, 25 years ago. So 10% of our electricity comes from that source today. Number 5, we have now a well-funded effort called the Global Threat Reduction Initiative in the Department of Energy, started in the Bush administration, to help secure dangerous nuclear material wherever it is all over the globe. And substantial progress has been made on that point. Number 5, along the same line, we've just had a Washington, D.C. gathering with over 40 heads of state gathered together by President Obama, pledging to get dangerous material, nuclear material, secured and blended down globally. It's not everybody, but it's a huge start. Number 6, we have a better funded, better supported, and more capable IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency, a very key ingredient in controlling proliferation. Number 7, we've recently had the President of the United States and the President of Russia pledge to work toward a world without nuclear weapons. And this pledge has been endorsed specifically by the UN Security Council. Number 8, we've had former leaders in 14 countries, including recently Russia, either endorse the vision and steps outlined in our Wall Street Journal article in total or in part, and that is very encouraging. Number 9, we have a signed arms control treaty, and Rose Garland Miller, who negotiated that treaty, is with us today. That signed treaty is revitalizing verification regime. Without the treaty, we will not have a verification regime. It basically also has confidence building, and it makes modest reductions in the number of weapons in both the U.S. and Russia. This treaty, of course, awaits Senate ratification and Russian Duma ratification. Number 10, we and our foundation, NTI, take delight in the fact that we have been able to help create a new Institute on Nuclear Security, a volunteer organization home-based in Vienna, dealing with dangerous nuclear materials all over the globe and talking about best practices and peer reviews. And we have over 300 members that have now joined that organization. So that makes us feel that we are making progress in terms of the awareness issue of how important it is to protect nuclear materials all over the globe. We have here Bill Potter, who runs the Monterey Institute, and I want to say that Bill Potter is doing a marvelous job in helping educate young people from all over the globe in the dangers that we face in the nuclear arena. Those young people, in many cases, because Bill's been around a while now doing his mission, they are now in leadership positions around the globe. So, Bill, you've got important work going on in education, and it makes a big difference. Finally, we have much we must work on in the next few years. Let me just name a few things in closing. First of all, a nuclear fuel bank, giving countries insurance of a supply of civil nuclear fuel so we can avoid enrichment proliferation, which is threatening us at this time. Number two in that category, transparency of the number of weapons, which has now been started by the United States and also by France, and we hope others will join, because without a baseline, it's very difficult, and we need a baseline on nuclear materials also. It's very difficult to be able to have the kind of data you need for verification and enforcement as we move down the ladder. The next item, we have growing support, although we have a long way to go, acknowledged, for a fissile material cutoff treaty, stopping the production of weapon-grade material around the globe. And I would list number 4, declaratory policy changes, which are now being debated. That is, what we use nuclear weapons for, what the purpose of those weapons is. In my view, declaratory policy also has to be coupled with changes in operational doctrine, not simply declaring, but also demonstrating that things have changed. And then, in wrapping up the things that we have to work on, and there's much to work on, this is a partial list: ratification of the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which can help contain and prevent proliferation in new states around the globe. And winding up my list of tasks that we can achieve and we can work on in the next few years, we can continue to try to persuade people all over the globe that Iran and North Korea and other would-be proliferators are a threat not just to the United States of America, but indeed to global security. And finally on my list is that 90% of the nuclear weapons are located in Russia and the United States, and that would be true also of the materials. We basically, one of the great omissions of the post-Cold War era is that Russia does not have a place in the Euro-Atlantic security regime. It's not easy. It's not going to be agreed to easy, but we've got to start debating and talking with the Russians, and that kind of debate and discussion is beginning. In my view, it's enormously important, not just in the nuclear arena, but in the biological arena, in the energy arena, and the environmental arena, and other arenas, that Russia be part of, in some fashion, the Euro-Atlantic security and economic zone. And finally, on that score, this administration, as well as the NATO leadership, is talking to the Russians about some type of cooperation on missile defense, which could be a game changer. With 90% of the weapons between the United States and Russia, it's pretty apparent that if we could find ways to work together on defending against those weapons, I think the bulb would go off in our heads that perhaps we could have many fewer of them, and certainly many fewer that would be on the prompt launch type status. So those are just a few of the areas that we have worked on. I could make you another list, and I won't, of all the challenges and all the avalanches that could come down the mountain and the rock slides. But let me just say that if you look where we are now, and you look where we were 20 years ago, remarkable progress has been made in this arena. And I think particularly our young people need to put that in perspective. A large part of that is based on George Shultz, his inspiration, his vision, his leadership. George has truly inspired us all. As I view it, in this overall effort to protect our nation's security and also God's universe, we are in a race between cooperation and catastrophe. What George and the Hoover Institute are doing here is, in my view, making the cooperative side run a lot faster. So thank you, George Shultz, and thanks to everybody here at Hoover and Stanford. And with that, I'll turn the mic over to George Shultz.
Sam, we need you around here much more to tell us all the things that are actually being accomplished. It's refreshing, you know, you work away and all of a sudden you take a deep breath and say, hey, there are a few good things that are taking place. Can't go wrong on that. Well, we've been having and continue to have here yesterday and today a very stimulating conference on the subject of deterrence. And we're very privileged this noon to have as our speaker the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen, as our speaker. He's thought a lot about this subject, and he comes at it from quite a career. He started out in Hollywood. His father worked with Jimmy Durante. Most of you people are so young you probably never heard of Jimmy Durante. But Jimmy Durante had a terrific act. So good, in fact, that his signature line was, "Everybody wants to get into the act." So it's been quite an act that Admiral Mullen has put on. He's a graduate of the Naval Academy. He's gone through all sorts of broadening type programs in his career. He's commanded 3 ships, 3 battle groups, war and peace. So he's been around. He knows the traps. He also is a person who stands out as somebody who's always looking for the right thing to do and pushing and probing for that. And I was particularly struck, and all of us were, when he was here a couple of years ago with his wife, who's here today, Mrs. Mullen, at the preoccupation that both of them had with our veterans, with the families of those who have fallen in battle, with injured members of our armed forces. So his preoccupation just wasn't on what we're doing today and so on, but also deeply concerned about the people involved, particularly those who have been in harm's way and have paid the penalty. So I know my wife and I were very moved. After they left, we said to ourselves, gee, these are 2 wonderful human beings. And with all of the duties that somebody with all these stars has as Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, it's so refreshing and wonderful to see that they are preoccupied with human problems, and they realize how important it is that we think about these all the time. Well, it's a great privilege, especially for me here then at this luncheon, to introduce Mike Mullen, Admiral Mullen, to speak to us about his view on the subject of deterrence. Admiral Mullen.
Thank you, George. Well, good afternoon. I hope I can live up to that, particularly the Jimmy Durante piece of it. And I want to thank Secretary Shultz, Secretary Perry, Secretary Kissinger, Senator Nunn, Minister Brown, and everyone else who has taken time to really focus on this, because I really do believe this is a critical subject, and there has not been a lot of focus on this in recent years. It, from my perspective, was a gap in the sort of enthusiasm, the glee, the joy that occurred from the Western perspective when the wall came down. And we have, at least I believe, we find ourselves in a position where we're struggling with what deterrence is and can be in the 21st century. So I really do appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I'm also mindful of the depth and the breadth of the experience here in this room as current and former high government officials, secretaries of state, defense, senators, You've been rightly recognized as the very architects of our national security. So I'm humbled, encouraged, and thankful for your continued service and your continued leadership, because we need it. And we are all in your debt for the decades of leadership that you have provided. I think, Mr. Secretary, one of your staffers noted that between you and Secretary Kissinger, Secretary Perry, and Senator Nunn, there are over 200 years that have been spent thinking about the use, deterrent effect, and elimination of nuclear weapons. Today, I bring a little more than 40 of those years to bear of my own thinking on the topic, off and on. Though, to be honest, some of those years were spent on liberty in some of the greatest ports in the world. So I make no pretense of expertise, but I do have the microphone here for a few minutes. And what was it that Mark Twain used to say? The less a man knows, the bigger noise he makes, and the higher salary he commands. By that measure, you're in for a real treat this afternoon. Truth is, I've been given the topic of deterrence a great deal of attention since assuming this office. And it's my view that we haven't paid enough attention to it, nor have we adequately resourced it. Deterrence today, and I don't have to tell you this, is tougher and more complex. More than one nation can now reach out and touch us with nuclear missiles. Americans are potential targets of terrorism wherever they travel. And regional instability in several places around the globe could easily erupt into large-scale conflict. Yet we've done precious little spade work to advance the theory of deterrence. Many, if not most, of the individuals who worked deterrence in the 70s and 80s, the real experts at this discipline, they're not doing it anymore. And we've not worked very hard to try to find their replacements. I'll tell a brief story from my own experience. I went to a brief war college course in 1989, and there was an Air Force lieutenant colonel who had been in the Air Force about 20 years, and we had 2 or 3 sessions with him on deterrence. I couldn't imagine someone knew any more about the subject than this individual, who had spent his whole career on deterrence and nuclear weapons. I mean, it was one of those things that just made your head hurt sitting in class. We don't have anybody in our military that does that anymore. And not unlike the nation, and in fact even the globe, we've let those skills atrophy, and I think to our detriment. Back then, in the '89 timeframe, it was as if we all breathed a collective sigh of relief when the Soviet Union collapsed and said to ourselves, well, I guess we don't need to worry about that anymore. We were dead wrong. The demands of deterrence evolve, and as Dr. Oppenheimer once opined, the atomic bomb made the prospect of future war unendurable. It has led us up those last few steps to the mountain pass. And beyond, there is a different country. Frankly, the country beyond Oppenheimer's mountain pass is significantly different than what most of us imagined prior to the end of the Cold War. I won't bore you with the history, particularly since many of you wrote that history. But suffice it to say that even as often and as quickly as things change, most nuclear arms agreements between the U.S. and the former Soviet Union had 2 elements in common. The realization that a lack of understanding invites instability through uninformed and unconstrained reposturing of nuclear forces, and a common desire to improve bilateral relations. For example, perceived missile and bomber gaps led to the SALT talks, which produced the ABM Treaty and an eventual, albeit temporary, freeze on arms production, all within the backdrop of détente. The ebb and flow of politics and history have made such agreements the products of exquisite timing, requiring a so-called alignment of the stars to succeed, as some of my Valley friends from down south might say, while other efforts were doomed to fail. A flood of Soviet troops into Afghanistan dissolved support for SALT II in the United States, whereas the fall of the Berlin Wall and later the Soviet Union may well have hastened the signing and ratification of START. Today, we lack a similar treaty with Russia. In fact, we haven't had one for almost a year now. But the arms buildup in the aftermath of SALT II's disintegration highlights the necessity for some sort of understanding, some sort of verifiable reduction and monitoring regime. And I don't want to sound like too much of a caricature of my Southern California upbringing, but I think the stars I mentioned earlier have aligned once again. Consider this. President Obama committed to the pursuit of a nuclear weapon-free world and an agenda to reset the U.S. and Russian relationship. Russia has a vested interest in combating the export of terrorism and heroin from Afghanistan, where we are also engaged in costly but critical combat operations. The world economic situation and outlook have forced governments worldwide to re-examine expenditures with a particular emphasis on defense budgets. I think these converging interests laid the groundwork for Presidents Obama and Medvedev to sign the New START treaty this spring. And as I have said, and I know to a certain extent I'm preaching to the choir, its ratification and implementation is the right thing to do because we actually took the time to do it right. And I want to recognize extraordinary work of so many in that regard, particularly Assistant Secretary of State Rose Gottmuller, who is here with us today. And I was with Rose a lot of these negotiations, and she and her team did extraordinary work. The New START treaty allows us to retain a strong and flexible American nuclear deterrent. It strengthens openness and transparency in our relationship with Russia. It also demonstrates our national commitment to reducing the worldwide risk of nuclear incidents resulting from the continuing proliferation of these most dangerous weapons. I am convinced that New START, permitting us as it does 1,550 aggregate warheads and the freedom to create our own force posture within that limit, leaves us with more than enough nuclear deterrent capability for the world that we live in. I am convinced that it preserves the strength resident in our nuclear triad and that it retains our flexibility to continue deploying conventional global strike capabilities. I'm also convinced that the verification regime is as stringent as it is transparent and born of more than 15 years of lessons learned under the original START treaty. There will be 18 inspections annually, a mixture of both deployed and non-deployed strategic systems, and we'll be working much harder to share data concerning the numbers, locations, and technical characteristics of systems subject to the treaty. In other words, we'll know a lot more about Russian systems and intentions than we do right now. And as I have said many times in many different contexts, in this fast-paced, flatter world of ours, information and the trust it engenders is every bit as much a deterrent as any weapon we deploy. It's what I don't know and what I can't see that makes me nervous. So I believe, and the rest of the military leadership in this country believes, that this treaty is essential to our future security. I believe it enhances and ensures that security, and I hope the Senate will ratify it quickly. There is, as you know, a separate but equally distinguished cohort that opposes ratification of the New START treaty. Typically, they talk about missile defense, pointing to the preamble language that accepts an unspecified interrelationship between nuclear weapons and defensive systems. They say this gives the Russians what they want, no serious effort by the United States to develop and field such systems. There's nothing in the treaty that prohibits us from developing any kind of missile defense. And the President has made it clear that we have every intention of furthering those goals. We couldn't possibly be more open about it or about why we are doing it. To wit, we've already shared a great deal of our missile defense plans, policy, and programs with Russia, and have promised to continue to do so in order to assuage their fears. Insomuch as the success of deterrence is defined by the absence of attack, I believe Russian adherence to date to the tenets of New START indicates acceptance of our current and future missile defense plans, despite public conjecture to the contrary in both the Eastern and Western hemispheres. So awaiting the conclusion of this last chapter in the U.S. Russia nuclear arms saga, we have the opportunity to peer further into Oppenheimer's Country Beyond the Mountain Pass. And we would be well counseled to review our climb to this point when we consider a rising nuclear power like China. The greatest lesson I think we can apply from our experiences with Russia to China is that in the realm of nuclear arms, transparency of strategy and clarity of intent, issues which have concerned me about China specifically, go a long way towards promoting stability. To paraphrase Secretary Kissinger, in deterrence, the assessment of risk becomes less precise in the face of unprecedented destructiveness. In a world with an unfortunately increasing number of nuclear-armed actors, there is precariously little room for error in that assessment. And in light of the U.S. and Russian nuclear stockpile reductions, a lack of understanding about China's strategy and intent forces new consideration about our security commitments to our allies. And I would say the same about Iran, although in that case there's very little doubt indeed of their intent to further destabilize an entire region and thus the entire globe. I'm hopeful that our military relationship with China will grow following Secretary Gates' visit to Beijing next year. And in doing so, both parties can gain the insight they need to minimize any error in their risk assessments. And I remain somewhat hopeful that the diplomatic and economic levers being applied to the Iranian regime will render from it a more responsible and productive approach to their role in the Middle East. The sanctions are beginning to bite, but thus far I've seen no retrenchment from their declared path of nuclear weaponization. This bodes ill for their neighbors, and ultimately it bodes ill for the Iranian people, who must labor and live under the jackboot of a government that has chosen isolation over engagement, conflict over cooperation, and extremism over moderation. Indeed, as much as our experience prepares us to engage other rational, state-based competitors, it leaves us desperately wanting a philosophical framework for dealing with terrorists armed with WMD. The world faces a complex and adaptive network of radical and violent ideologies that binds disparate individuals, movements, organizations, and even states. And while not all extremist groups share the same goals or ideology, they do retain sufficient autonomy to make their own strategic choices, which in my mind makes them vulnerable to some form of coercion, and perhaps even deterrence. In contrast to most states, violent extremist groups are more prone to expand, regress, splinter, or die. Earlier in their life cycles, they struggle to survive by recruiting members and acquiring resources. Choices are made by elites who tightly control the use of violence, primarily for symbolic or opportunistic reasons. During growth, where most of these groups currently linger, formal structures form as leaders try to overcome the difference between what they want and individuals actually do. Decision-making pressures grow as leaders seek to accommodate a wider array of stakeholders. We see some of this with the Taliban in Afghanistan, who still desire to govern and who continue to reach out to al-Qaeda and other like-minded groups for aid and assistance. This fact, coupled with the increasing pressure being applied by NATO and Afghan forces, helps explain why some of them, though not the very senior leadership, are seeking preliminary talks with the Karzai administration. They want power and influence. They want legitimacy. As groups like this, or like Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza, integrate with and become part of government, they will start losing non-state status. The closer aligned the group is to the state, or the more governing responsibilities it assumes, the more susceptible it is to influence. That's why I've always believed that the ultimate solution in Afghanistan is political, not military. Individual terrorists, however, are often another matter. Because by the time someone makes the decision to commit an act of terrorism, our deterrent has already failed. The weapon of choice, be it a suicide vest, an airplane, or a weapon of mass destruction, is just a matter of availability. To really deter terrorism at that level, the conditions that led a person to that decision point must be addressed. Attacking the humiliation, the hopelessness, the illiteracy, and abject poverty which lie at the core of the attraction to extremist thought will do more to turn the tide against terrorism than anything else. We can continue to hunt and kill their leaders, and we will, but when a person learns to read and he enters a gateway toward independent education and thought, he becomes more capable, more employable, and enjoys a sense of purpose in his life. He will understand the Quran for what it is and not merely what his mullah says it is, who's equally uneducated. He can raise his children to a higher standard of living than the one he knew and aspirations shared by parents around the world. And his wife will help him prevent the despair that might lead a child of theirs into the arms of Al-Qaeda or the Taliban. These accomplishments delegitimize the terrorist ideology, replacing the fear they hope to engender with the hope they fear to encounter. Now that is a deterrence of truly strategic nature. This isn't dreamy pie-in-the-sky thinking. My friend Greg Mortensen has lived it in rural Pakistan and Afghanistan, as he documented in 2 books. His story about the elders who keep the Taliban from burning down a village merely by standing in front of it lasts only a few pages, but it speaks volumes. To be sure, in places where terrorists have had free rein, as they did in Iraq and continue to do so in parts of Afghanistan today, security is necessary, but it is not sufficient. Ultimate solutions cut across the realms of diplomacy, intelligence, economics, and social progress. No clear-cut line divides these pursuits anymore, and none should. They demand a working relationship between host nations, alliances, international organizations, and volunteer groups alike. Indeed, relationships at every level, from personal to institutional, are critical to success, but particularly in a crisis. Even during the darkest days of the Cold War, the U.S. and Soviet Union maintained a diplomatic relationship, and that relationship brought the world back from the brink during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Conversely, today, we have almost no relationship with the world's most threatening, aspiring nuclear states, Iran and North Korea. That alone is cause for concern. And that's why I spend so much time with General Kiani in Pakistan, a country we abandoned back in 1990. It is why I conferred so regularly with General Makarov during the New START negotiations, and why I've sat cross-legged at shuras with Afghan elders in the Panjshir Valley. Relationships are vital, and while it is good to have friends on Facebook, and I'm up to 13,000 now, there's no substitute for actually being there. The value that underpins any relationship, working, adversarial, or otherwise, is trust. Our allies and partners can trust we will stand by them in bad times and good. We will pursue treaties that allow us to trust but verify among nuclear-armed nations. And our enemies should trust that they will be held accountable for any attack against our nation, our allies, or our interests. Trust requires credibility, and credibility is built on reliability. This applies to our national will as much as our conventional or nuclear forces. The best way to ensure reliability is through the regular exercise of sustainable procurement and life cycle practices for both hardware and personnel. Admittedly, this is an area where we've been improving, and frankly, there was plenty of room for improvement. We canceled programs that were simply unaffordable, such as the F-22. We demerved all of our Minuteman III missiles, simultaneously making our arsenal more difficult to attack while decreasing the cost and difficulty of maintenance. And we ensured the long-range health of our nuclear stockpiles by incentivizing careers at the Department of Energy for young engineers. And I might add here that despite claims to the contrary, we have remained and will continue to remain committed to nuclear infrastructure modernization. We must do that. We have been credible enough up to this point in history, but that is no reason to rest on our laurels. And as I said, we need a new model, so as I look to the future, I have to do the math. Deterrence is said to be based on a rational calculus of costs and benefits. But I graduated near the bottom of my class at the Naval Academy, so I prefer it to see it as a multiplication problem as opposed to calculus. In that equation, deterrence is our total national capability, not just our nukes, times our national will to engage, times a potential adversary's perception of that capability and will. And if my math is right, and I think it is, there's every reason to believe the U.S. remains a good friend to our allies and a formidable foe to our enemies. And I wouldn't have it any other way. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for everything you've done, everything that you continue to do in the service of our nation. And I'm honored to have had the privilege to speak with you today, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Maybe two questions. Who's got the nerve to ask the Admiral a question? Probably Bill Perry will get one. Yes.
Rose.
Rose. This is Rose Godmiller, our start negotiator.
Admiral Mullen, I just wanted to express my appreciation to you. People don't know the details. He mentioned how much he did engage with his counterpart, General Makarov, and it was an extraordinarily effective intervention, the two of them at various times in our negotiations. So, word of appreciation. And as you look further down the road, you've furthered your relationship with General Makarov recently with a number of visits. You've met with him, but also among your subordinates, they've been meeting with their Russian counterparts. So how do you see that military-to-military relationship developing from here on out?
The relationship that I see is, quite frankly, a direct byproduct of the relationship between our two presidents. And both of them have worked it hard. I'm at a point now where I can routinely call him if I have questions, and he me. And in fact, we've actually recently started a very robust set of staff talks where, so it isn't any longer just the principals, it is now some of my most senior officers who have established a relationship across a whole host of issues. And I'd go to Senator Nunn's comment. I think that the criticality of including Russia in the Euro-Atlantic security architecture, and certainly in other ways, but my lane is security, is absolutely critical. And I've been inside NATO on a lot of this as well, as NATO tries to figure out what its relationship with Russia is going to be. And I think it is something leaders have to continue to focus on for many, many reasons in terms of the overall assurance of security in ways globally, and certainly in the areas that we have both focused on for many, many years.
Admiral Mullen, what do you think of the prospects for ratification of the START Treaty, and what do you think citizens can do to maybe
What do I see of what do I think?
What can we do to enhance?
Well, as always, I mean, you can certainly represent yourself to your congressmen, your senators, and your senators very specifically. It's difficult to predict, Secretary Perry, how this is going to come out. I know it's a priority for the president. It's something that I've said time and time again. I'm very comfortable with every aspect of it, to include the reductions. We have plenty of military capability, preserves the triad, invests in the nuclear infrastructure, which we needed to do. There's some $80 billion or so over the next decade that are invested there, and it isn't all just about investing in upgrading our facilities, because we need to invest in our young people. We need to invest in our intellectual capacity and capability in this area as well. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there. So, and I spoke specifically to the missile defense issue, the global strike issue. You know, I'm from a military perspective, I'm very comfortable with the treaty, and quite frankly, so are my counterparts. So I really think it's critical that we move forward. We are coming up in December. It will be 1 year without anywhere to verify, no connection to the Russians, and these, as was pointed out earlier, the two of us have 90% of the weapons in the world. There's a responsibility from my perspective tied to that we all have. So I'm hopeful that it will be ratified as soon as possible. Probably the most significant argument I've seen against it that is out there has been the missile defense piece. And I mean, in this, as I participated in this, there is nothing that I see in any way, shape, or form which jeopardizes our ability to develop missile defense capabilities. And we're doing that. I mean, we haven't slowed one bit since we were engaged in this treaty. The issue of global strike, the issue of verification, I mean, we work very hard on verification. The number of inspections, the exchange of data, and it is very robust. And it's robust in particular in the world that we're living in. This is not 1991. This is 2010. And that we would adjust the verification regime given where we are with the numbers made all the sense in the world to me, but it gives us, and we're exchanging data that we've never exchanged before. So I'm very comfortable with that. Those, I think, are the three areas that are of big concern.
Admiral Mullen, we thank you very much for coming, for addressing us, responding to questions. And I want you to know that here at Stanford and Hoover, when somebody comes and gives a wonderful address, we believe in rich rewards. So here is a Hoover tie.
Hey, thanks.
But even more, we know that your wife is here, and you always have to pay attention to her, right?
Thank you, George.
So this is a scarf that you can give her.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.